Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. This is the one you voted for. Well, maybe not you specifically, but the majority of you did. So here we go. GeForce RTX 4070 versus Radeon RX 6950 XT. From the 40,000 plus people who voted, over half of you wanted to see the 6950 XT do battle with the RTX 4070, making the 6950 XT by far the most popular GPU for this 40 game comparison, covering the 1080p, 1440p and 4K resolution. So we do have loads of data to go over, but before we get into it, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Skytech Gaming, a provider of pre-built gaming PCs in California. They offer lifetime technical support backed by well-trained customer support, and all their systems feature a 1-year parts warranty. One of their newest pre-builts is the Azure 2, which Skytech Gaming sent over for us to check out. This is a well put together PC that looks great, the BIOS has been tuned for optimal cooling and noise performance, and the cable management is extremely neat. It features the new GeForce RTX 4070 along with the Core i5-13600K, and this allows it to deliver impressive mid-range performance, while supporting all the latest and greatest features such as DLSS 3 frame generation, ray tracing, and AV1 encoding. So, to get the right PC built for you, check out the link in the video description. Okay, so those of you wondering why we're comparing AMD's previous generation flagship to Nvidia's new mid-range offering, it's because in most regions they're currently similarly priced. For example, the most affordable RTX 4070s over at Newegg.com right now are available at $600 US, so the MSRP, whereas the cheapest 6950 XTs cost just $30 US more, so well below their MSRP. And this makes the 6950 XT an attractive option for many because at $630 US, it offers more VRAM than the 4070 and more raster performance. So more VRAM for future games and more performance now for roughly the same price. That seems like a pretty good deal, but there are some drawbacks and I will be certainly discussing those towards the end of the video. For now, I want to see just how these two GPUs compare across a massive range of games with and without ray tracing enabled. So without wasting any time with GPU specs or stuff of that nature, let's quickly go over the system specs and then jump into the graphs. For testing, the CPU used is the Ryzen 9 7800X3D, which has been paired with the Gigabyte X670 eAorus Master using 32GB of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory. As usual, we'll go over the data for around a dozen of the titles tested before jumping into the big breakdown graphs, and the resolutions of interest here are 1080p, 1440p and 4K, so let's get into it. First up we have Cyberpunk 2077, and here the 6950 XT is clearly faster than the RTX 4070. The GeForce GPU trailed by a 16% margin at 1080p, 18% at 1440p and then 21% at 4K. This data has been gathered using the high quality preset, and for those of you with high refresh rate monitors, the experience will be noticeably better with the Radeon GPU at 1440p. That said, you can enable upscaling, and the RTX 4070 can take advantage of DLSS plus frame generation, so in reality, both will deliver a very smooth gaming experience in this title. Now, enabling ray tracing, that does shut down the 6950 XT, and without the aid of upscaling, a 60 FPS experience just simply isn't possible even at 1080p. That said, despite being 35% faster at 1080p, the 4070 falls just short of 60 FPS, so you will need to enable DLSS here. Moving on to Fortnite, we find that both GPUs deliver excellent performance in the DirectX 11 mode using the Epic quality settings. Here the RTX 4070 was 7% slower at 1080p, 13% slower at 1440p, and then 13% slower at 4K. So not massive margins, but the Radeon GPU was consistently faster under these test conditions. But again, the issue for the RDNA 2 based GPU is ray tracing. And here we see when using hardware ray tracing with Lumen and Nanite enabled, that the performance tanks, reducing the 6950 XT to just 50 FPS at 1080p, and that meant the 4070 is now 30% faster with 65 FPS. Next we have some Far Cry 6 results, and again the 6950 XT is the superior performer with ray tracing disabled. Here the RTX 4070 was 16% slower at 1080p, 15% slower at 1440p, and 21% slower at 4K. And it's the margin seen at 4K that will be the most noticeable to gamers. Jumping up from 77 to 98 FPS, we'll see the Radeon GPU delivering a much smoother experience, but the RTX 4070, it's hardly slow here. Now, with ray tracing enabled, the RTX 4070 is able to best the 6950 XT in Far Cry 6, at least at 1080p and 1440p, where it was 3% and 5% faster respectively. So performance overall is really much the same, and this is certainly also true at the 4K resolution, which saw the Radeon GPU win by a mere 4% margin. The Radeon RX 6950 XT looks mighty impressive in Dying Light 2, rendering 161 FPS at 1080p using the high quality preset, and that meant it was 21% faster than the RTX 4070, 27% faster at 1440p, and then 28% faster at 4K. But once again, when enabling ray tracing, the results flip, and now the RTX 4070 is seen to be 28% faster at 1080p, 29% faster at 1440p, and then 27% faster at 4K. That said, without upscaling, the 1440p and in particular 4K margins are meaningless as frame rates are just too low. But the 1080p margin is relevant, and here the RTX 4070 does deliver a noticeably better gaming experience. Running the Callisto Protocol using the Ultra preset on these GPUs is a breeze. Both pumped out over 80 FPS at 4K, and although the RTX 4070 was faster at 1440p and 4K, there was basically nothing in it. But as we've seen time and time again, where the margin opens up is with ray tracing enabled. Now the RTX 4070 is 25% faster at 1080p, 16% faster at 1440p, and 22% faster at 4K. Again, the 4K results, they can pretty well be ignored here, but going from 61 FPS to 71 FPS seen at 1440p, that is a nice performance uplift and will certainly be noticeable. Moving on to the Hitman 3 results, we find yet another game where the 6950 XT is able to outperform the RTX 4070 with ray tracing disabled. In this example, the RTX 4070 was 15% slower at 1080p, 12% slower at 1440p, and 24% slower at 4K, where the Radeon GPU was good for a buttery smooth 104 FPS, while the 4070's 79 FPS is nothing to scoff at, but the 6950 XT did offer a noticeably better 4K gaming experience in this title. But once again, if you're to enable ray tracing, the RTX 4070 does become the dominant GPU, though how relevant this is, at least without upscaling, is kind of difficult to say. Certainly 4K is out of the question. Even with the aid of DLSS 3 frame generation, it's not going to be a great experience, especially if you're even remotely sensitive to input lag. 1440p on the other hand, that should be viable with the help of DLSS, and certainly 1080p will enable a great experience. Next up, we have Spider-Man Remastered, and using the maximum in-game quality preset, but with ray tracing disabled, we're looking at some very impressive FPS figures from both GPUs. Performance overall was much the same, but it's the over 200 FPS at 1080p, over 150 FPS at 1440p, and over 80 FPS at 4K that's impressive. Then, even with ray tracing enabled, performance is still excellent, with both GPUs rendering over 80 FPS on average at 4K. By far, the most noteworthy margin is seen at 1440p, where the RTX 4070 is 7% faster, but few games will be able to notice the difference between these two GPUs in Spider-Man Remastered. Playing Resident Evil 4 using the prioritized graphics quality preset, which disables ray tracing, is a breeze for either of these GPUs. That said, the 6950 XT is clearly the best performer here, as the RTX 4070 lagged behind at 1080p by a 13% margin, then 19% at 1440p, and 23% at 4K. Surprisingly, even with ray tracing enabled, the 6950 XT is able to remain ahead of the RTX 4070 in Resident Evil 4, and at 4K is seen to be 21% faster. So this is one of the very few examples we have of an RDNA 2 GPU delivering better ray tracing performance. Control is an older video game that was released back in late 2019, so unsurprisingly, it does play at very high frame rates on these GPUs, though there is an option to enable ray tracing, and we'll look at that in a moment. Now, using the highest quality settings with RT enabled, the RTX 4070 was good for 185 FPS at 1080p, making it 12% slower than the 6950 XT. Then we see a 14% reduction in performance for the RTX 4070 at 1440p, and in my opinion, the drop from 138 FPS to 118 FPS is noticeable, and certainly much more noticeable than what we see at 1080p. Then at 4K, the 6950 XT was good for 66 FPS, making the 4070 12% slower, with an average frame rate of just 58 FPS. As you'd expect, enabling ray tracing does heavily reduce the frame rates, but even so, we're still looking at comfortably over 100 FPS at 1080p for both of these parts, and in fact performance is now basically identical, and this is seen at not just 1080p, but also 1440p and 4K, though 4K will require some upscaling to boost those frame rates. F122 enables ray tracing by default with the ultra high preset, but the RTFX aren't super noticeable in this game, at least in my opinion, and turning them off leads to massive performance gains, especially for Radeon GPUs. The 6950 XT, for example, that blew the RTX 4070 out of the water at 1080p, delivering 34% more performance. The RTX 4070 was also 22% slower at 1440p and 20% slower at 4K, so really an easy win here for the Radeon GPU, though it has to be said, both were more than sufficient even at 4K. Now, here we see with ray tracing enabled that performance is more than halved, which in my opinion is a joke, given how little impact RT has on the image quality in this game. Again, I guess that's subjective, my opinion, but I think most people will agree that F122 doesn't have the most amazing ray tracing effects. Still, even if you want to play the game with ray tracing enabled, the 6950 XT is the faster of these two GPUs. The RTX 4070 was 9% slower at 1080p, 13% slower at 1440p, and 12% slower at 4K. Now, the last game we're going to look at the results for is Hogwarts Legacy, and here the 6950 XT smashed the RTX 4070 using the ultra quality preset. The GeForce GPU was 23% slower at 1080p, 29% slower at 1440p, and 24% slower at 4K. Then, if we enable ray tracing, we find that both GPUs are CPU limited at 1080p at around 60 FPS, then at 1440p the RTX 4070 nudged ahead by a few frames, and then at 4K the 6950 XT is much faster, as the 4070 appears to run out of VRAM. That said, with just 28 FPS at 4K, it's somewhat of a hollow victory for the Radeon GPU. Okay, so we've just had a look at almost a dozen of the 40 games tested, focusing on those tested with and without ray tracing enabled, and now it is time to see how these two GPUs compare across all of the games that I've managed to benchmark. So let's do that, and of course we will start with the 1080p data. First, here's a look at the standard rasterization results. So no ray tracing enabled results are featured in this data. This means, on average, the RTX 4070 is 12% slower than the 6950 XT at 1080p when opting to ignore ray tracing. Some of these results will be CPU limited, others like Death Stranding have an FPS cap. Actually, I think Death Stranding is the only game to have an FPS cap. We generally try to avoid those, like God of War, for example. And then some games just see very competitive results. There are half a dozen examples where the 4070 is much slower than the 6950 XT, trailing by a 20% margin or greater. Now, if we look at the ray tracing enabled data, we find that on average, the RTX 4070 is 12% faster at 1080p. And in all instances, we are looking at playable performance. In about half of the games tested, performance was fairly similar, but we did see examples in games such as Hitman, the Callisto Protocol, Dying Light 2, Fortnite, and Cyberpunk 2077, where the GeForce GPU was much faster. Now, bumping up the resolution to 1440p increased the margin from 12% to 15%, meaning on average, the RTX 4070 was 15% slower than the 6950 XT at 1440p. We saw just a single example where the GeForce GPU was faster, seen in the Callisto Protocol, where it won by a mere 3% margin. But once again, if we focus on ray tracing performance, the results flip, and now the RTX 4070 is on average 11% faster than the 6950 XT. There are just two examples where the Radeon GPU won, and a further 4 where we only saw single-digit figures, and then 5 where the 6950 XT was completely crushed. Then finally at 4K, the RTX 4070 was on average 17% slower than the 6950 XT, and we did see a blowout for the GeForce GPU in The Last of Us Part 1, where it simply ran out of VRAM, and those results were recorded using the most up-to-date version of the game. The ray tracing enabled 4K results are largely meaningless, as there were very few examples here where frame rates were acceptable, though interestingly the 6950 XT does stack up much better here, and actually ended up delivering slightly more performance overall. But again, frame rates were generally too low for both GPUs, and you'd have to look at stuff like upscaling and frame generation on the GeForce GPU to achieve acceptable levels of performance. And even then, depending on your preferences, it just might not work out. Overall, across a wide range of games, the GeForce RTX 4070 and Radeon RX 6950 XT are surprisingly similar in terms of performance, though the margins for certain individual titles can be reasonably significant. As it stands right now though, at major online retailers such as Newegg, the RTX 4070 is 5% cheaper, and at 1440p for rasterization performance it was 15% slower, but it was 11% faster when focusing on ray tracing. So picking either of these GPUs based solely on price and performance, it's just not going to be an easy task as they are very similar. Having said that though, if one of these GPUs is particularly strong in a game or set of games you play, then that might help sway you one way or the other. For example, the 6950 XT was much faster in The Last of Us Part 1, A Plague Tale Requiem, and Hogwarts Legacy, for example. But as I see it, the key advantage of the 6950 XT is its extra 4GB of VRAM. Certainly not a massive advantage, but still an advantage all the same, and it is generally faster for standard raster performance. The advantages, though, of the RTX 4070 include much lower power consumption. Total system usage is generally around 200 watts lower in our test system, dropping from around 500 watts with the 6950 XT to just 300 watts. That's quite a significant saving. The RTX 4070 also enjoys support for DLSS, which is the best upscaling technology available right now. And then there's frame generation, a feature completely absent from the 6950 XT and all Radeon GPUs for that matter. The 4070 also supports, and I think this is a crucial one, at least in my opinion, AV1 encoding, and it's certainly a massive feature for those of you who plan on streaming or even recording your own gameplay. And then there's the superior ray tracing performance, which, depending on your preferences, may or may not be a big selling point. You guys know that generally I don't care too much for ray tracing performance. Again, I play mostly competitive multiplayer games, so ray tracing is not something you really look at turning on there in games like Fortnite, for example. But that's just me. Tim likes single player games, and the more immersive you can make it, more graphically realistic or whatever it is you're after, then ray tracing can help out there. Of course, the performance penalty is still massive, but the RTX 4070 does a pretty good job of playing the modern games with a reasonable degree of ray tracing enabled and achieving acceptable frame rates at lower resolutions. Anyway, that's something for you to decide on. Clearly though, regardless of what my opinion is, if ray tracing is high on your priority list, then as we always say, you would go with the GeForce GPU. You simply wouldn't even entertain buying the 6950 XT. You would just get the RTX 4070 or some kind of GeForce GPU. On a personal note, I think had the RTX 4070 been armed with 16GB of VRAM or more, which it absolutely should have been, you wouldn't even be considering the 6950 XT for a 5% premium. But as it stands, I think it is a viable option depending on your preferences and how concerned you are with stuff like a 12GB VRAM buffer moving forward. And I don't really have any comments on how concerned you should be about that at this point in time. And in this example, we are really only talking about 4GB. It's not exactly a significant difference, not like what we saw when comparing the RTX 3070 and RX 6800, for example. A doubling of VRAM is far more significant than a 33% increase. Still, it is a factor worth considering. For me personally, if I had to buy a GPU right now, or I had a $600 US budget in mind, so I wanted to buy a GPU right now, I would personally pick the RTX 4070 for no other reason than the improved efficiency and AV1 encoding, or no other reasons, because that's two things. Anyway, those things, AV1 encoding in particular, super useful to me, and that's why I would pick the RTX 4070. Anyway, let me know which of these two products you would buy, and I'll be sure to read your comments. Also, if you liked this video, I think that thing goes without saying, subscribe for more content. There'll be some more GPU benchmarks coming up, some ones that you're not going to want to miss, so make sure you are subscribed. They're coming up shortly. Again, you don't want to miss them. And also, maybe Floatplane and Patreon are things you want to check out because you'll get access to our exclusive Discord server for members only. Tim and myself are active there and chat with you guys. We also have a monthly live stream where we chat with you guys live, answer your questions there. We do behind the scenes content, Q&As, a lot of cool stuff there. So if you're interested, check it out. But if not, perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.